My husband introduced me to his CEO as his roommate, not his girlfriend, not his wife of 4 years, his roommate. I smiled, shook the man's hand, and watched my husband's boss go very still, look at me for a long 3 seconds, and say one word. Claire? What Ethan didn't know, standing there in his rented tuxedo with his hand loosely at my back like I was a coat he'd forgotten he was holding, was that his CEO already knew exactly who I was, and by the time that gala ended, the lie Ethan had been telling his entire office for 8 months was about to collapse in front of every person who mattered to his career. If you've ever caught someone rewriting who you are to a room full of strangers, stay with me, because this story has a very specific ending, and if these stories are the reason you keep coming back, go ahead and subscribe now. My name is Claire. I'm a forensic accountant, the kind companies hire quietly before a merger to make sure nothing's buried in the numbers that shouldn't be. And 4 years into my marriage, I found out my husband had been telling his entire company he was single. I need you to understand what I actually do for work, because it matters for everything that happens later. I don't do routine tax returns. I get called in by boards and acquiring companies to go through a target company's books line by line before a deal closes, looking for exactly the kind of thing people hope nobody looks closely enough to find. Inflated expense reports, personal spending routed through corporate cards, vendor relationships that exist on paper and nowhere else. I've ended careers with a spreadsheet. I've also cleared people who were wrongly suspected, because the numbers are the numbers, and I follow them wherever they actually go, not wherever someone wants them to. I chose this career, in part, because I grew up in a house where money was never discussed honestly. My father ran a small business that quietly failed for 2 years before anyone in the family knew, because he kept telling my mother everything was fine while the numbers said otherwise. I was 17 when the truth came out, watching my mother's face as she went through boxes of bank statements she'd never been shown. I decided, somewhere in that same year, that I wanted to be the kind of person who could always find the real numbers, no matter how carefully someone tried to hide them. I never expected that instinct would eventually turn toward my own marriage. Looking back, there were a handful of Ethan's work events over the years where I noticed people seemed slightly confused about who I was. Brief moments I explained away at the time. A holiday party 2 years ago where a coworker asked if I was the sister he mentioned. A summer barbecue where someone assumed I was a +1 from a dating app rather than a wife of 2 years. Each time, Ethan laughed it off with some version of, "People don't really pay attention," and each time I believed him, because I had no reason yet to suspect he was the one doing the shaping of what people paid attention to. Ethan and I met the ordinary way, through mutual friends, 4.5 years ago. He worked in business development at a mid-sized logistics firm, the kind of job with a lot of client dinners and a lot of travel, and I respected that he took it seriously. What I didn't fully appreciate early on was how little he actually asked about my work in return. He knew the word forensic accountant and used it at parties like a fun fact about me, but he never asked what a typical engagement looked like, never asked which companies I was working with, never seemed curious about the part of my life that took up 40+ hours a week. I told myself that was normal. Not everyone needs to understand the details of what their spouse does. I know plenty of couples like that. We got married 3.5 years ago. Small ceremony, 60 guests. Both of us professionals who'd built our lives before we met each other. I kept my maiden name professionally, Claire Whitmore, the name on every audit report I've ever signed. Partly for continuity with my client relationships, partly because I'd built a reputation under it long before Ethan came into the picture. Socially, at his work events, at holiday parties, I was always introduced as Claire, his wife. Nobody at those handful of events ever needed my last name specifically. I never thought about that detail again until it became the exact thing that unraveled everything. Our early marriage was genuinely good, or at least it felt that way from where I was standing. Ethan was attentive in the ways that mattered to me at the time. He remembered my clients' names when I mentioned frustrating engagements. He cooked on Sundays. He showed up to my cousin's wedding even though he barely knew anyone there. I don't say any of this to make what happened later more painful in the telling, though I suppose it does that anyway. I say it because I want you to understand I wasn't married to an obvious villain. I was married to someone who slowly, almost imperceptibly, started keeping a second version of his life running alongside the one I could see. About 8 months before the gala, Ethan's company underwent a leadership shift. A new VP of business development, a woman named Sandra Kess, took over his division, and Ethan started talking about her constantly at dinner, about how she was building a really tight team, about international expansion opportunities for people who were flexible and unattached enough to relocate on short notice. I noticed the word unattached more than once. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was just corporate language about work-life boundaries, not a description he was quietly applying to himself. The travel increased first. Ethan started taking client trips 2, sometimes 3 times a month, always framed as essential for the expansion pipeline. I didn't question it much, because international logistics genuinely does require that kind of travel, and I trusted him the way you trust someone you've built a life with. What I noticed instead was smaller. He stopped mentioning coworkers by name the way he used to. For years I'd heard about Dave from finance, or the guy who always microwaves fish, ordinary office chatter. That stopped almost entirely, replaced by vague references to the team and everyone on the trip. I found out about Vanessa by accident, the way you find out about most things that someone's been careful to keep vague. Ethan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, a text preview visible on the lock screen. "Can't wait for Chicago. Don't tell Sandra we're extending the trip." Signed with a name, Vanessa, and a heart emoji. I stood there holding a coffee mug, reading it twice, feeling something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with jealousy in the way people usually mean it. It was quieter than that. It was the specific feeling of realizing you've been living next to a version of your husband's life you were never given access to. I didn't confront him that morning. I've learned, professionally, that confronting someone before you understand the full shape of a discrepancy usually just teaches them to hide it better. So I watched, carefully, the way I'd watch a set of books that didn't add up. I noticed he'd started leaving his laptop bag zipped in a way he never used to. I noticed a hotel loyalty email that mentioned a double occupancy upgrade for a trip he'd told me he was taking solo. I noticed, 3 weeks before the gala, that his LinkedIn profile had quietly changed his relationship status visibility to private, something he'd never bothered adjusting in 4 years of marriage. I started keeping my own quiet log, the way I do at work when something doesn't add up, but I don't yet have the full picture. Dates, small inconsistencies, nothing dramatic, just a private column of facts I wasn't ready to act on. March 14th said he was in Denver. Hotel confirmation email showed Chicago. April 2nd mentioned the team had dinner without naming anyone, unusual for someone who used to complain about every coworker by name. April 19th, LinkedIn relationship status went private. I wasn't building a legal case. I was just doing what I always do when the numbers stop reconciling, writing down what I actually observed instead of what I was being told. There was one dinner, about a month before the gala, where I almost asked him directly. We were sitting at our own kitchen table, the same table we'd eaten at for 3 years, and he was telling me about a promising new hire on Sandra's team, someone who'd really impressed leadership already. I asked casually what her name was. "Vanessa," he said, without missing a beat. No hesitation, no flicker of guilt, which somehow unsettled me more than if he'd stumbled over the answer. He said her name the way you'd say any coworker's name easily, like he'd said it 100 times before, which I would later understand he probably had. The gala invitation arrived 2 weeks before the event, addressed to Ethan and guest, an annual company event I'd never been invited to before, because Ethan always said spouses weren't really part of that world. This year, apparently, spouses were welcome, and Ethan asked me to come with something in his voice I couldn't quite place at the time. Not enthusiasm exactly, more like a man calculating a risk he'd decided was manageable. "Sandra wants the whole team to bring someone," he said. "It'll look good." I said yes, mostly because I was curious what that world actually looked like, and because some part of me, the professional part that spends its whole career trusting patterns over explanations, already wanted to see the discrepancy in person rather than just in stray text previews and hotel emails. I spent the 2 weeks before the gala doing what I always do before walking into a room where something doesn't add up. I paid attention, quietly, and I got ready. Before I tell you what happened when his CEO said my name, I want to know, if you'd started noticing small inconsistencies like that in your own marriage, would you have confronted it immediately, or watched quietly and gathered the full picture first, the way I did? Tell me in the comments, because the answer might surprise you when you actually picture yourself in that kitchen. What Ethan didn't know, because he genuinely never asked enough about my work to find out, was that 6 months earlier, before Sandra Kess had even taken over his division, I'd been retained directly by his company's CEO, Robert Whitfield, to conduct a confidential due diligence audit ahead of a potential acquisition of a smaller logistics competitor. It was routine work for me, the kind of engagement I do several times a year, and I'd worked directly with Robert on 2 prior occasions for other clients before he ever recruited me for this one. He knew me professionally as Claire Whitmore, forensic accountant, a name and reputation entirely separate from anything Ethan had ever mentioned about his personal life, because Ethan, as far as I could tell, had simply never mentioned my full name to his own CEO in 4 years of working there. The audit itself was unglamorous work, the kind nobody outside a finance department ever thinks about. Pulling 3 years of expense reports, cross-referencing them against calendars, client contracts, and travel logs, looking for the small inconsistencies that usually mean nothing and occasionally mean everything. I'd been at it for weeks before the gala, working mostly from my own office, communicating with Robert's finance team through a shared portal that never once mentioned any names beyond the department level. I had no reason to connect any of it to Ethan. His division wasn't even the primary focus of my engagement. The entertainment expense flags were something I'd noted almost in passing while working through a broader compliance sweep. I remember the exact afternoon I flagged the Chicago charge, sitting at my desk with 3 monitors open, cross-referencing a client entertainment line item against the corresponding sales calendar. No client meeting existed on that date. I made a note, routine and unremarkable, the same kind of note I make dozens of times in any given audit, and moved on to the next line item without a second thought. It's strange, looking back, how ordinary that moment felt, given what it would eventually mean. The audit had actually turned up something relevant weeks before the gala, though I didn't understand its full significance until that night. Reviewing expense reports tied to the international expansion pipeline, I'd flagged an unusual pattern of client entertainment charges submitted by a small group within business development. Dinners, hotel upgrades, and 1 extended stay charge in Chicago that didn't match any client meeting on the corresponding calendar. I'd noted it as a routine compliance flag, the kind of thing that gets forwarded to HR for review without any personal context attached, because from where I sat, it was just a set of numbers that didn't reconcile. I had no idea, flagging that Chicago charge, that I was looking at my own husband's expense account. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but because I've learned that how you show up in a room affects how seriously people take what you say in it. And some part of me already suspected I might need to say something that night, even if I couldn't have told you exactly what yet. Ethan seemed nervous in the car, checking his phone twice at red lights, and I remember thinking, at the time, that it was just normal work event anxiety. I understand now, it was something closer to a man walking toward a collision he didn't know was coming. At the gala, Robert Whitfield greeted people near the entrance, the way CEOs do at these events, working the room efficiently, a practiced smile for every handshake. I'd met him twice before, both times in conference rooms, both times in the context of the audit, both times as Claire Whitmore, consultant, not as anyone's wife. When Ethan walked up with me at his side, hand at my back, and said, "Robert, this is Claire, my roommate," I watched something complicated cross Robert's face. Recognition, confusion, and then a very fast, very careful recalibration. The look of a man realizing two separate parts of his professional life had just collided in a ballroom. "Claire?" he said, and there was real warmth in it, the kind reserved for someone he respected. "Claire Whitmore, you're—" He glanced at Ethan, then back at me. "You're Ethan's roommate?" I felt Ethan's hand tense against my back. "I'm his wife," I said evenly, "have been for 3.5 years. Robert looked at Ethan for a long moment, and I watched every ounce of his easy party host warmth drain into something much more careful. "I didn't realize," he said slowly, "that you two were connected. Claire's been doing confidential audit work for us for the last 6 months, Ethan. I had no idea she was your wife." Sandra Kess, standing a few feet away with a glass of champagne, had clearly caught enough of the exchange to go very quiet. I watched her eyes move from Robert to Ethan to me, doing her own quiet recalculation, the same one Robert had just finished. Whatever picture Ethan had built for his team over the past 8 months, I watched it start to come apart in real time, in front of exactly the people whose opinion of him mattered most for the promotion he'd apparently been chasing. Ethan's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then something closer to panic. The particular panic of a man realizing the two compartments of his life he'd worked hard to keep separate had just been welded together in front of his boss. "Claire, why didn't you tell me you were consulting for my company?" he said, his voice tight, trying to redirect the conversation onto me. "You never asked what my current engagements were," I said. "You haven't asked in months. I didn't know I needed permission to take a client." Robert cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to let the moment slide past unaddressed. "Ethan, I have to ask, given what I'm now looking at, Claire flagged an entertainment expense discrepancy a few weeks ago. A Chicago trip, double occupancy charge, no corresponding client meeting on record. That's under HR review right now. I didn't know until this exact second that the name attached to that report was your wife's." "That trip was legitimate," Ethan said, too fast. "It was a scheduling issue with the client. We had to extend—" "There was no client," I said quietly. "I checked the calendar against the expense report myself, Ethan. That's literally my job. I flagged it before I had any idea it was you. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you're standing here calling me your roommate to protect a story you've apparently been telling for months, and I think Robert deserves to know why an unattached, flexible team member suddenly needed a double occupancy room in Chicago." A woman I didn't recognize, standing near enough to have heard most of it, glanced at Ethan with an expression that told me she'd probably heard the unattached pitch directly from him at some point. I didn't know if she was Vanessa. It didn't matter anymore whether I ever found out. A few people near us had started to notice something was happening, the way a room always senses tension before it understands the shape of it. I kept my voice level, the same voice I use presenting findings to a board, because raising it would have made this about my anger instead of about what was actually true. "I'm not asking you to explain Vanessa to me right now, in this room," I said. "I'm asking you to explain to Robert why an employee he trusted enough to fast-track for international expansion has been telling his team he's single for the better part of a year." Ethan didn't have an answer ready. Robert, to his credit, didn't make a scene of it beyond that. He simply said quietly, "We'll finish this conversation in my office Monday, Ethan," and excused himself to greet the next arrivals, leaving the two of us standing in the middle of a ballroom full of people who had no idea what had just happened, and one CEO who now knew exactly what had. I didn't stay for the rest of the gala. I told Ethan I was leaving, and I did, alone, in a cab, still in the dress I'd bought for an event I now understood I'd only ever been invited to, because refusing me would have looked strange to Sandra Kess. Ethan called 4 times before I got home. I didn't answer any of them. He was waiting in the driveway when the cab pulled up, still in his tuxedo jacket, tie loosened, and for one brief moment, standing under the porch light, he looked less like a man caught in a lie and more like someone genuinely frightened of what he'd just lost. "Claire, please," he said. "I can explain the roommate thing. It's not what you think." "You've had 4 years to explain what I am to you," I said. "Tonight you had one sentence in front of your boss, and you chose roommate. That's not a slip of the tongue. That's the truth coming out when you didn't have time to prepare a better one." I used to think loyalty in a marriage meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, even when small things didn't add up. What that ballroom taught me is that the version of yourself someone introduces to the world is the truest evidence of what they actually think you're worth to them. And I was worth being erased, quietly, in favor of a story that made his life easier. Standing in that driveway, I saw something real cross Ethan's face for just a moment. Not performance, not damage control, something closer to genuine grief, like he understood, all at once, exactly what he'd thrown away for a version of himself that got to seem unattached and available at the office. "I don't even know why I said it," he told me quietly. And for a second, I almost believed the confusion was sincere. Then he added, "I just didn't want things to get complicated with Sandra's team before the promotion went through." And the ache I'd felt for him a moment earlier evaporated, because even standing in the wreckage of his own marriage, he was still doing the math on his career. Ethan moved out 3 weeks later. The HR review at his company concluded independently of anything I said that night, and it wasn't kind to him. Vanessa, I later learned, had no idea he was married either. I don't know what happened to that part of his life, and I've stopped being curious about it. Robert still calls me for audit work when his firm needs it, and neither of us has ever brought up that night directly. Some things don't need to be discussed twice to be understood. I still think sometimes about that word Robert said in the ballroom, my own actual name, spoken with recognition and respect, at the exact moment my husband had just tried to make me smaller than that. I didn't need him to say it to feel like I mattered, but I won't pretend it didn't help. Hearing someone else say my name like it meant something, in the same breath my husband had just tried to erase it. I've thought a lot since then about how easily this could have stayed hidden if Robert hadn't happened to know both versions of me. If I'd taken a different client that year, if Ethan had introduced me correctly out of habit instead of calculation, I might still be living inside a story I didn't know was being told about me at his office every single day. I don't know if I'm grateful for the coincidence or unsettled by how close I came to never finding out. Probably both. If someone has ever introduced you as something smaller than what you actually were to them, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments below. If this story hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth has a way of showing up in the room you least expect it to. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because next week's story might be the one that feels like it was written about your own life.